But we talk mostly about celerity, about that speed, which is typical Julius Caesar. That was his virtue. If you had to single one out, it would be the virtue of celerity. But we don't practice it ourselves, and we haven't really got very much into the text. We spend an awful lot of time talking about everything under the sun, or wandering around talking about vast historical movements, none of which can be proved. I suppose we would have to say that these are commonplace opinions that we're handing down here. One of the things that's happened in the modern world, of course, by modern I suppose you'd have to say Renaissance on, but it's happened with increasing intensity, has been to debunk received opinion, to debunk everything traditional, and to substitute for it some kind of pseudo-scientific attempt to get at a measurable truth. If you went to the library today and looked up Caesar, in any large library, you'd find 1,000 books, and probably of the 1,000, 950 of them have been written in the last 30 years. And of those 950, 949 would be explaining that Caesar was nobody. That the past is misunderstood, that this is just a myth, and that Caesar was really either a scheming politician or a mediocrity or a woman or I don't know what theory we might come up with. And I always do feel a little bit nervous putting things in semi-permanent form like tapes and so on, where someone is likely to hear this who's, although our immediate audience will be in sympathy with what we're doing, sometimes these tapes get loose and somebody in the academic world will pick it up and say, well, this is all just nonsense.
They say they obviously haven't read the latest book
right.
or the latest library of books on Julius Caesar, which definitively refutes everything that they say.
Gaul is not divided into three parts. See, that's nonsense. Gaul is divided into 143 different parts, and then they'll go on about some new division or some mathematical idea about what Gaul really is. Well, I guess we've said this before, but we hope to do nothing more than to assert received opinion, things that are accepted. We are not critical. That is, we have rejected, hands down, that whole attitude toward truth, which got its start in the Renaissance, and it was a revolt against tradition. That's what the Renaissance was. It was a rejection of all received opinion. That's pick any Renaissance genius you want in any field, and that's what he's going to say he's doing. In painting, Leonardo da Vinci invented new ways of painting, new ways of perspective. The old painters didn't know what they were doing. I am a genius. I'm going to discover a whole new way of doing it. And for that matter, Columbus, I guess, discovered America. It was an age of discovery, but before you can go anywhere, you have to depart. And when we speak of the Renaissance, we often say it was an age of departure and discovery. Something was being left behind. And what was being left was all that received tradition. Now, of course, those Renaissance authors didn't win in a day, and that received opinion is still around. They didn't completely obliterate it. I think if you ask the average man in the street, Julius Caesar, he'd say, "Oh yes, great man." I still don't think that the critics have won, but they've occupied the universities and they've occupied the libraries.
Yeah, well, when the new science came along, and it came along in the 16th century, that was probably the greatest intellectual movement of the time, and all of the you'd say all of the best minds really followed that new thing called the new science. And that was a complete rejection of everything in the past. They felt sure that they could prove that everyone else had been wrong about the universe. And that is in the most obvious ways, such as whether the sun goes around the Earth or vice versa. They said, well, that's been proven to be wrong, and it really destroyed confidence in the past. They said, well, if all of that isn't true, maybe nothing else is true. And a completely new way of looking at philosophy grew up as a result of that, and a completely new way of looking at the world grew out of it. And as Mr. Senior says, it didn't by any means it really only reached the learned to start with. And there was no such thing as universal education. It only began around the 19th century when all of these ideas about rejecting the past began to sink down into the minds of ordinary people who received some sort of education, because the education they received was in the hands of those debunkers, and still is.
University education.
Yes, university education.
Of course, the schoolmasters were still conservative.
True.
They still taught Julius Caesar.
Yes.
I can even remember in my childhood.
Sure.
The old Latin teacher was still in awe of Julius Caesar and thought he was the greatest man who ever lived.
Yeah.
The village schoolmaster kept up pretty much the old traditions, but then he wasn't very well educated. He went to a 2-year school and was disdained by the university people. But today we would use the word, I guess, intellectual, the intellectuals. I don't know, but what if you take the world as a whole, it's still governed pretty much by received opinion. Depends on your trade. The farmer knows perfectly well that the sun rises and the sun sets. He's not going to be too disturbed by theories of Galileo about the universe.
He never thinks about it.
No.
He never thinks about it, for one thing.
He's kind of skeptical about them when it's presented to him. He thinks, you're funny guys, you have all these theories, but...
and to discount them as being unimportant. That's what difference does it make to him? He says, well, who cares?
Someone was talking the other day about an old farmer who was interviewed on the television. They had a program about farming, the state of farming in America, because it's in a state of disaster today with the economic situation. And they had some old farmer, and he said, well, those guys from the experiment stations and from the agricultural universities and colleges, they come out, and one of them said to me, you got an insect problem here on your farm. And he said, oh, yeah. He says, I've got some bad insects, but then I've got some good insects. He said, I think I'll keep them both for a while. He said, the good ones eat the bad ones. I'm not going to fool around with all your poisons and all of your... It was very, very funny to hear some crusty old fellow like that, who still does exist. And that's the kind of opinion that we're talking about here as we sit at this table. We're taking what the old farmer says about Julius Caesar.
Yeah, well, even the sort of semi-educated graduate or college student has received the attitude that you ought to be skeptical about all of the received ideas, and he's able to recite them. If you go to him and you say, was Julius Caesar a great man? He will probably say, well, no, I'm sure that he really isn't. He doesn't know, of course. He's never read Julius Caesar. He's probably not read any of the books about Julius Caesar either, but he knows that it's not safe to say that Julius Caesar is a great man. Now, if you
he's been disturbed.
If you present Julius Caesar to him in an open way, he's perfectly susceptible to realizing that Caesar really is a great man. He hasn't made up his mind on the basis of any kind of real reflection or study or anything of the sort.
This conversation we're having is enormously important. You remember the last book that Jack Maritain wrote? I guess some other books have been published subsequent to his death. his notes and things. But the last book that he himself wrote was a remarkable book, and particularly remarkable for him. He called it The Peasant of the Garonne. I was reminded of it because the Garonne River, is one of the divisions of the three parts of Gaul. Mm-hmm. All of Gaul divided in three parts, and one of the divisions is the Garonne River, which separates Aquitania from the rest of France. And Jacques Maritain pretends in that book to be, he writes in the first person, and he writes it in the person of an old peasant, an old farmer. And the whole point of the book really is that this man, Jacques Maritain, who's certainly one of the most brilliant intellectuals, if ever there was an intellectual of the 20th century, you would have to say it was Jacques Maritain. He almost retired the idea of being intellectual. Very smart, very learned, knew everything that the universities knew. But in his extreme old age, takes upon himself that voice. We've lost regard for the commonplace. That was the whole point of the book. The old peasant knows more than we do. That is, we've lost our ability to see the most obvious things, the plain and simple truth of things. It's a very moving, old man's book. I suppose the critics didn't like it. It wasn't accepted as part of the canon, as a matter of fact. But it is a rather remarkable, just loose collection of monologues.
Yeah, well, Maritain thought of himself as being a metaphysician, and I suppose he was a metaphysician. And study of metaphysics is really the study of the most obvious thing, which is being. That's the most obvious thing there is being. And he said that from time to time. That is, he said that.
But you lose your grip on the obvious when you study it too much.
You begin to study it, and pretty soon the being reality begins to recede from your vision. That's the whereas the farmer is someone who, by the very nature of his work, never loses a grip on reality. That is, if he does, then his farm fails. He can't go on being a farmer if he begins to stand aloof from the realities of the bugs and the fertilizers and the plow and the
crops. It's
crops.
certainly one of the reasons why agriculture, all over the world, I said in America, but it's a worldwide phenomenon, agriculture is in a chaos. It isn't just crisis. It's a chaos because it's been abstracted from that ordinary reality. In fact, the peasant no longer exists in advanced countries, so-called advanced countries. The whole thing is agribusiness and is all done with planning boards. The most notorious example of the Soviet Union, where they can't grow anything because the whole thing is controlled by abstractions. And it's getting pretty much to be the same way all over the world. Agribusiness, we call it in the United States.
Farming by technology, and technology is another way of distancing yourself from
it's done,
immediate
by
reality.
planning. They do it on paper. We need so many millions of this and 10,000s of that. And we'll plow up so many millions of acres and do this and that. And we've lost regard for that elemental grasp of things. Now, Julius Caesar has this reputation in Western civilization, I think we said it last time, of being the greatest man who ever lived from a secular point of view. And we take him as our model. Young children were brought up once upon a time. Schoolboys were brought up on this book that we have before us as a model, first of all, as a model for writing. Well, we mentioned that last time. Writing plain, straightforward, peasant prose. Nothing intellectual about it, nothing fancy. It just gets the job done, but with remarkable precision, clarity, celerity. Those are its qualities. But not only the writing, Caesar also is held before us as the paradigm of the leader. I don't know how many conversations I've had in the last few years in various places with various people about their institutions. They're all gummed up. Hospitals don't run. Universities don't run. Businesses don't run. We have the Harvard Business School mentality. Again, an attempt to make a science out of administration. An attempt to make a science out of leadership. As if you could devise a method for being a leader, and then any damn fool could do it. If you want to improve a hospital, or you want to improve a religious order, or you want to improve a university or a business, I think anyone would say right away, we've got to have some leadership. There's no question about that. Well, how do you do that? Well, take a look at Julius Caesar and see what he did, the way he behaved, and you've got a picture in concrete, vivid terms of the kinds of things that men do when they really want to get something done. I don't suppose there's anybody in the world who's ever accomplished more than Julius Caesar. And his life wasn't all that long. Was he 56, something like that, when he died? And he got started late, as a matter of fact. He was 40 when he started. So that this accomplishment was really done in 15, 16 years. And yet, the most extraordinary things, he got the job done. Well, how did he do it? Well, let's take a look at how he did it. See, let's read this book and notice how he did it. In the first place, one of the most obvious things about this book is that he doesn't tell you how he does it. He does it.
Yeah, he doesn't. There's no theory here.
No theory.
There's no theory of leadership in this book. In fact, there's almost no theory. I'd say there's no theory in this book at all.
About anything?
No, he doesn't. There's no how-to aspect of this book. He doesn't give you a pattern in the sense that he gives you a method for doing it, a technique for doing that sort of thing. He simply does it.
Because he doesn't. I mean, I think you'd have to infer from that that really he doesn't believe that there is a technique. I mean, it doesn't come to mind. But isn't this what the Renaissance discovered? Again, that you find a technique for doing things?
Yeah, well, it comes ultimately from the new science, which was a method. It comes from Descartes in philosophy, who said there is a method. And if you can find the method, then you can learn anything.
See, when I said a moment ago, if you read this book, you'll find out how to be a leader. What I said is very misleading. Yeah. Because I think immediately somebody would say, oh, I know what you mean. It's a method book. It's a book that tells you how to be a leader. Oh, no. Just the opposite. It's a book that really tells you how to be a leader, because the first thing it tells you is that there isn't any how-to. It's a picture of a man in action. And you learn by absorbing the personality of that man. You get to know him by the end of the book. And I think everybody who's ever read this book gets to know him, to respect him, even to have a kind of awe of him, but at the same time a peculiar sort of friendship. That is, it's not the awe of distance. It's an awe of closeness. You like him. You're not afraid of him. That is, you would fear his wrath, but you wouldn't be afraid of him.
No, you fear him as an enemy. You wouldn't want to have him as an enemy. What you want to do is have him as a friend.
But he's engaging. Yeah. He's the kind of a man that disarms you. You expect that a person like that would be cold and distant and severe. I don't know. I have an image of Oliver Cromwell. I don't think you'd ever call him Ollie. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know much about Cromwell. That's just an image I have. But the image I do have is of a sort of severity. But with Caesar, he's a very lenient man, very strong, but flexible. I don't want to say pliable, because you're not going to get him to do something he doesn't want to do. But within the limits of how to do it, he's very, very flexible.
Well, you see, rigidity is the characteristic of the man who is following a plan. He's got a fixed idea, we say, an idée fixe, about how the thing is supposed to be done, and he follows that plan. And if something comes along that deviates, he pays no attention to it. He goes right on. He's not going to. He says, "I have my idea here. I have my plan, and I'm going to follow it. And I'm not going to allow anything out there, any reality that comes along to make me swerve from that plan. Whereas Julius Caesar doesn't have a plan. And that's he doesn't have. What is? See, you can look back. I think a lot of historians have come to grief over Caesar because they look back on him and they say, "My gosh, it looks as if he must have had a plan." That is because, and the way things worked out, he affected the whole direction of Western civilization and the immediate direction of Roman history for centuries to come. And you say, well, when you look back on it from that kind of perspective, it looks as if he must have had some sort of scheme in mind that he worked out step by step. But that's just not the case. You can tell by reading this book that he's not that kind of a person. In some ways, he is. We use the word pragmatist. In a good sense. I'm not a follower of the pragmatic philosophy.
I'm not talking about William James.
No, but there is all it really means. That's an old word. It's a Greek word originally. It really, we get our word practical from it. It's the opposite of the theoretician. What we're saying is that Caesar was a practical man who dealt with immediate problems. He didn't have. He wasn't a man who had a long view of history or anything of that sort. If he did, no one ever found out about it. He never talked about it to anybody. He never wrote anything about such a vision. Caesar, in so far as politics was concerned, Caesar was a man who established I'm going to say idea, but of course you don't want to say that. The fact that the state needs a ruler, a leader, just as all institutions need leaders. That the person is the principle of the state, not some system.
Not the Constitution.
Not a constitution.
In the Greeks, even there are a lot of books on the Constitution of Athens or the Constitution of this and the other thing. Even Plato really does prescind from persons in the Republic. That is, he has a class, but he doesn't conceive of the leader.
Well, he has the philosopher king. He wants the philosopher king to be the ultimate model of.
He does say that.
Yeah. But the way it actually is worked out is that there is a class.
It's a class.
Yeah.
Almost as if through education you could bring people up in such a way that the thing would run. Caesar, he's just not a philosopher at all. He was very respectful of philosophy. He had studied it. He
liked to talk about
it. But he himself was a man of action. And his dissatisfaction, if you would, with... I mean, if you contrast this book to Plato's Republic, it's quite a contrast. It really is. They're totally different worlds. The Republic is a reflective, meditative, contemplative book. This one is all right there, here and now, in action. And Caesar would be skeptical about philosopher kings, I think. I don't suppose he ever mentions that.
Well, of course, he would say, I think, he's a very intelligent man. I think he would say,
philosophers don't make good kings.
No, philosophers don't make good kings, and kings don't make good philosophers either, as a rule. Right. A philosopher should be wise, a king should be wise, but that means he should make wise decisions. It doesn't mean that he should invent wise ideas. He ought to make good decisions and judgments about particular things. What's the right thing to do here and now? That's what you need in a king. Now, of course, Plato is perfectly conscious of this, because he understands that there is a contradiction or at least a paradox involved in the idea of the philosopher king. He knows that perfectly well. That's why his students in the Republic say, well, now, come on, Socrates, do you think this would really work? And he says, well, I'm not talking about whether it would work or not. What I'm talking about is what is the best kind of government. That's all. That's what we're talking. We're philosophers here. Whether it would work or not is outside my province. There he is as the philosopher. And if Caesar were there, he'd say, well, but that's the most important thing.
We do know, I don't think we talked about this at the time, but we do know that Plato himself did try on a couple of occasions to carry these ideas out. And they were total disasters. The most notorious of them was the Syracusan adventure. One of Plato's students was the son of the dictator of Sicily. And the son inherited his father's dictatorship. It was sort of like baby Doc in Haiti inheriting the kingdom of Papa Doc. And so Plato got into his airplane and flew over there and said, at last we're going to have a philosopher king. And the story goes, somewhat exaggerated, that nobody ever heard from Plato again. And so his students back in Athens got a little bit worried about this, and finally they sent over a delegation to go hunt and find out what happened to poor old Plato. And when they landed at the seaport or Syracuse or wherever it was in Sicily, they got off the boat. There on the dock was Plato in a cage, and he was being sold into slavery because the tyrant had turned on him, and the public opinion went against him. So they had to buy him back. Took him back to Athens, and he went back to his university, went back to his teaching. Now, the story is exaggerated, certainly exaggerated as I told it, but true. That Plato did indeed realize in his own life the folly of attempting to impose on a concrete reality perfection. That is the perfection that he could see with the mind. And Aristotle, of course, never made that mistake. I think he learned from Plato's experience. That is, Aristotle never advocated in his politics the idea of a philosopher king. He assumed that politics would always be imperfect. That is, by definition, it was imperfect. It's the science of the possible, isn't that the definition? And it's not the science of the perfect. It's what can be done. The beginning of all politics is, well, what can we actually do here? And in that sense, I suppose Caesar is a natural Aristotelian rather than a Platonist.
Although in many ways, in many ways, Caesar does very strongly resemble the aristocratic man that Socrates describes in the Republic. That is, he has all those marks.
Virtues.
He's very simple. He lives a very austere life, not a luxurious life. He's not somebody who follows anybody at all. He's an original, some people say. That is, where did he get this ability from? Well, he didn't get it from any place.
He doesn't work from received opinion.
No, he doesn't.
The way we do. He doesn't.
No, he's the guy who wrote the book, as it were. I mean, he wrote the book.
He's what we're receiving.
Yeah, he is the received view, but he's the one who started it. You say, well, where did he get it from? Did he derive it from studying Greek philosophy? Well, no. He probably did study Greek philosophy.
He did. He studied at Rhodes. He studied. In fact, he studied Greek philosophy. Yes, he did.
The Romans all did, but it's all here transformed into action, and it doesn't really resemble in any pattern. It doesn't resemble the society that's the Roman society that was ultimately created by Caesar. It doesn't resemble, or the political way that he created is not something that resembles anything in Greek thought. But he himself personally does resemble that aristocratic man, precisely, well, as we say, in being an originator of a principle of being I suppose we would say, the principle. Well, that's what he says that the principle of the state is. The principle of the state is a person. It's a man
who has to govern.
Who governs. Yeah.
There isn't any constitution which will solve all the problems. We in the United States, again, and a lot of the nations of modern Europe, have got this Cartesian idea that if only you could have the perfect constitution, the state would run by itself. That there would be some kind of automatic system. We call it the system of checks and balances here in the United States. That the framers of the American Constitution were just drunk on method. They thought they could get a system. We call it the American system. And Woodrow Wilson thought it could be exported all over the world. And you still hear in the American newspapers anyway that idea that what we have to do is export democracy, we call it. Caesar had none of that at all.
There's a system of government called democracy, and that's what we ought to see is instituted everywhere, because it's a system that works. It has a universal applicability, but it doesn't.
No, it doesn't even work here. And one of the terrible things about systems is that they do tend to make leadership impossible. That is, it's a rare, it's almost a miracle. I was going to say accident, but it's almost a miracle in the democratic system to get a great leader.
Well,
it's only happened about 3 times in the whole history of the United States.
Yeah.
Most presidents are mediocrity.
To use a much lower kind of example, the man who has created the most stir in the business world in the United States in the last decade has been Lee Iacocca of, is that General Motors? Or is it Chrysler? Ford? I forget. Chrysler.
Yes.
He's really quite a remarkable man. He has a kind of Caesarian personality, and he has, by gosh, right away people say, well, maybe he ought to be president, because people look for, they like that kind of leadership, that kind of strong personality. Now, I don't mean to exalt him or anything of the sort, although I heard somebody, he gave the graduation address out in California, and somehow I met somebody who heard him talk the other day. Her son or daughter was graduating from Santa Clara, and Lee Iacocca gave a talk, and she said, gosh, he was just remarkable. Yeah, I mean, he just bowled everybody over. And he's not an intellectual in any way, but he does have that force of conviction and that strength that you do look for in leaders. And he's very rare. He's very rare in business. He's not typical at all of what you look for. He's not the Harvard business school model by any means of how to run a business. But it's perfectly true that in fact it's always rare. We were saying that in the United States,
we say George Washington and Abraham Lincoln were great presidents, and then we start to worry whether we can find any other. And I suppose if we do find any, we tend to find the earlier ones as we go back to Adams and Jefferson and so on. That is, the more the system goes on, the more impossible it gets for anybody to break through the system. In other words, systems are not only contrary to leadership, they're contradictory to it. They tend to prevent it, to make it impossible for somebody who is a natural leader to survive the process.
Yeah, and they're discouraged from even trying. That is why it's perfectly obvious that they won't fit. I think it dawned on me probably rather late in my life, this fact. That is, it sounds like cynicism, but I can't remember which presidential campaign it was where it really dawned on me that it really didn't make any difference who was elected. They were in those days, it was 2 relatively different men. As I say, I don't remember who it was. They were quite different, and their political philosophies were quite different. But I went around saying to everybody, well, I just can't see that either one of them is going to make the least bit of difference. They both have to go to Washington, and they both have to live with that system that they have there. And I can't really see.
It really is a system of checks and balances.
Checks and balances.
It really is.
Right. This fellow has one program, and the other guy has another program, and all right, let's grant that they're quite different, though they're not all that different. Neither one of them is very radically different. But if one fellow gets in, he's going to find that his program is going to be watered down to the point where, in order to be passed through this system of checks and balances, to the point where it will hardly be recognizable as his system at all. It will be a blend of his ideas and his opponent's ideas. And his opponent would find exactly the same situation when he came into office. So it really doesn't make any difference.
When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he really cut through the red tape. He destroyed the system. And of course, this is one of the reasons why he is hated by the intellectual community, to use a word that's been abused today. That is the modern scientist that we were talking about, who dominates the university today, is a man of method. He's a man who believes in technology. He's a man who believes in systems. And Julius Caesar is an affront to him. He has to debunk him. He has to say he's not a great man. He has to say that these things that are said about him aren't true. Because Caesar, he recognizes him as an enemy. That is, if these things are true about Caesar, then goodbye to the method and goodbye to the system.
Then the man really does become tremendously important. He becomes really everything. The man becomes everything, and the system becomes nothing. Comparatively speaking.
This became a great debate 100 years ago among English-speaking people with the work of Thomas Carlyle. I guess we've mentioned him before, the English historian, 19th century man of letters. Thomas Carlyle advocated what he called the great man theory of history. And of course, again, he turned it into a theory.
He called it hero worship. Hero worship. He wanted to revive hero worship.
But it knocked the intellectuals on their ear, and they hated Thomas Carlyle. They tried to exterminate him, and he was never accepted by the scientific. He still isn't. He's not considered a serious historian today. No. I think if you went to the history department of any university and you said Thomas Carlyle, they'd be guffaws. Well, he was
crackpot. He's just a crackpot.
And maybe very talented. Some of his essays are striking, and the English departments will put him on their reading lists because he was he was a crackpot and he wrote well. But nobody takes him seriously as an historian. But his notion was, it came to him almost like an epiphany, a discovery. If you look at history, it's the work of a handful of great men. For better or worse, that is, some of them are bad men. They don't all do good. But Oliver Cromwell was a great man. In fact, he was one of Carlyle's heroes, I think, wasn't he? He was a great man. He did terrible things to the Catholic Church. He did terrible things to Ireland. He did terrible things to England, for that matter. But I think anybody looking at the history of the 17th century would have to say, wow, what that man accomplished. He
made a difference. That's the thing.
I remember reading Hilaire Belloc. He has a life of Cromwell, and Belloc hated him. Just absolutely hated him. But he was in awe of him as a general. And again, he was a man with no training.
Yes, that's right.
He took a hold of an army, and he said, well, there isn't anybody else around. I guess I'll direct the army. And he defeated the method man of the royal forces. He turned out to be an astonishingly effective general. And the same way with Julius Caesar. Caesar was not a general. Again, who was the greatest military strategist? Who was the greatest general? Well, it really wasn't Caesar. Everybody knew that. Pompey, for example, he's called Pompey the Great, and he had much more experience, and everyone knew, including Caesar, that he was the better general. But the joke was, Pompey wins the battles and Caesar wins the wars. How come? Well, the historians, and by that I mean the Roman historians who reflected on this, I don't remember whether it's Plutarch who says this or Suetonius, but it's one of the Roman writers who makes that remark that Pompey won the battles and won the strategies and won the all of the things that generals do,
prizes,
but that Caesar won the war, and the reason finally was that Caesar was loved by his men, which baffled Pompey. That is, Pompey, this is later on, this isn't the Gallic War, these are the civil wars that followed, when Pompey and Caesar struggled for the control of the Roman Empire, the Roman government. Pompey made decisions on the basis of what an army could do. And Caesar's men did things that you couldn't do. They fought late into the night. As we said last time, they marched 60 miles instead of 30. And Pompey would calculate, well, now if you cut off their water and you cut off their food and you make them march for so many days, they'll weaken and they won't fight. And they did. They can't do that.
So you can love a man. You can't love a system.
No.
There's no possibility. You can't. This is the year of the Constitution, right? The year we're in 1987. This is an anniversary of the United States Constitution's ratification of the United States Constitution. Everybody's talking about it, and it's very interesting, I think. But the fact is that you really can't say that you love the Constitution. That would be ridiculous. You could say that you honor it, you respect it, you hold it in high esteem. You can say all of those things. But if you say you love the Constitution, gee, everybody says, well, that's kind of ridiculous.
I've never done it. Have you ever gone to Washington and looked through the glass cage?
I think I have. Actually,
it must be an incredible experience.
Yeah.
You go on a pilgrimage, and there is a glass case, and in it is a document.
Yes. Well, the things that are most interesting in the document are the signatures. Of course, that's what people look at. You look at it and say, "My gosh, look! Gee, there's
the force of a man is
there's
in there."
Benjamin Franklin. Now he was a man, I think that's one of the that's what makes.
In fact, John Hancock has retired the word.
Yeah, right.
He has the largest signature, the boldest signature.
Yeah, they were remarkable men, and it's their signatures that are the most interesting thing about the document. Whereas the document itself, you say, well, it's an interesting document, but that's what it is. It isn't anything else.
But no man, to paraphrase Carl Newman, no man ever died for a document. You can't do that.
He said no man ever died for an idea, which gets you very close to the same thing. Yeah. That is, an idea, and a document is an expression of an idea.
You have to have a man. When you recite the creed, a lot of people don't think very much about what they recite, do they? They really do think of the creed as a document in a way. They forget what they really say. I believe in God the Father. You don't say, I believe in these truths that we hold to be evident. We don't say that. We believe in a man, in a person, finally in a man, and that is in Christ. And without that, you couldn't have faith. You can't have faith in an idea. You can have faith in a man. But democracy, as a governmental system, is an attempt to have faith in a set of ideas, and no matter how good they may be, it's a vacuum. And I've often thought someday I'll do it, but I never did. To go all the way there and go through the line as if you were on a pilgrimage to a saint, instead of a bone, instead of the body of Saint Clare. Why, there's a glass case, and in it there's a document. You stare at it. I suppose the old Ark of the Covenant had some of that quality. There was a scroll.
I've been thinking here, of course, that the word document really has an honorable meaning. It's largely been lost, but I know in one of the old translations of the Bible. English translations of the Bible, where it says everything is written for our
doctrine.
Doctrine. Well, one of the translations is for our document. He says it just means teaching. It means for our teaching, and that's a different kind of thing. That is there you have a teacher who teaches. The Holy Spirit teaches through the Scriptures. Christ teaches.
But again, the idolatry of the book is an idolatry. Bibliolatry is all over the place today. Again, I know some priests who and when they say Mass, they hold up the book. They elevate the book. This is the word, they say, of God, and you say, well, no, that's not true. That's not true.
It's not the word of God.
It's not the word of God. It's the word. It's a word of God in another way, and metaphorically. The fathers of the church do talk about it as food, and all those things. But those are metaphors; those are not facts. And it's the literalization of a metaphor, I think, that makes it possible for people to do that. But
no, in fact, the idea of document, it changed. I once looked this up. I did a little study of it, and I noted the whole idea changed at a certain point in history.
Written.
It means written, whereas it didn't used to mean that. It was the living word of God that was a different kind of thing.
Well, do you remember the man we had to lecture here on creationism? And he was a good man, and we certainly liked him. But he said now. I want to make one thing clear right from the start. The Word of God was written by Adam. And it has been written, and the Bible we have began as a written book. He's absolutely convinced of that. He was convinced that it was the Word of God. It was engraved on